Sidetrack episode 61, A Really Old Church. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. You can go to agorapodcastnetwork.com to find more great, thought-provoking, and independent podcasts. You can find out more about the history of the papacy at a2zhistorypage.com. That's ATOZhistorypage.com. You can connect and like all the social media from there and link to Apple Podcasts where you can leave a rating and review. Those are really, really appreciated, so I'd love if you sent in those ratings and reviews. Before we dive right in, though, I am honored to announce our latest patron who achieved the power and glory of Rome, Seth the Magnificent. I know this shout out took some time, but I appreciate you hanging in there, Seth. I also want to express my gratitude to another new patron at the Antioch level, Ed. Thank you so much, Seth and Ed, and to all the patrons and all the people who submit reviews and everybody who listens. I really appreciate all your help and all your support. I'm not too much for these podcast update segments, let alone an entire podcast update episode, but there are a few items to bring you up to speed on. If you aren't into this, skip forward a minute or two to the music or listen to this quickly so we can catch up. I really want to say I'm sorry for how sporadic the History of the Papacy podcast new episode releases have been. This has been just a really busy, several years. I don't know how much people care about this sort of thing, but in the past 3 years, I started a new job, added a new child to my household, started a new podcast, Beyond the Big Screen, if you haven't heard me say that a few times, started some major home renovations, plus all the usual day-to-day things that get in the way of producing a podcast. Believe it or not, I think I've actually cleared up things and arranged things in such a way to produce History of the Papacy episodes more regularly, or at least consistently, which I'm very happy for. So definitely keep your podcatchers updated for new episodes of this podcast and new Beyond the Big Screen episodes. I also suggest you join the new A2Z History Page Facebook group. Facebook groups are a much better way to have conversations on Facebook and a great way to keep up with everything History of the Papacy and Beyond the Big Screen related. You can find a link to the group in the show notes. One more quick thing before we get started, I will also start a limited run of History of the Papacy and Beyond the Big Screen merchandise. I've been really hesitant to get involved in this whole merchandising thing. It's always seemed to me as something that would take away time that could be dedicated to making episodes. I've also had concerns about the quality and types of items that I could procure. My concerns have been assuaged to some degree, so I'm going to put together a limited amount of items, such as possibly t-shirts. I'm not completely sold on the idea of selling themed products, but I will give it a go. When we're up and going, I'll give you all the links on where you can shop for your A2Z History Page related products. This just might be your time to get some of these items because I can't guarantee how long they'll be available. Please contact me if you have any opinions on this new venture, show ideas, or possible future guests. The title of the episode today is A Really Old Church, and that is what we are going to talk about. The oldest identified church structure found so far. This church is the house church of Dura Europos in the modern-day Middle Eastern country of Syria. The story of the Dura Europos church and the city of Dura Europos generally is fascinating and devastating. It was devastating in the beginning, and it has been devastating in the modern day, so let's get started. Starting at the end first, the site of Dura Europos in most recent years has been destroyed by ISIS, or at least ISIS has tried to destroy it, much like the more well-known city of Palmyra a bit to the west. One fortunate thing is that Dura Europos has been very well studied since it was discovered in the late 1800s. A big push to excavate happened after the site was rediscovered by British soldiers right after World War I. The site of Dura Europos was studied by British, French, Syrian, American, Israeli, all basically archaeologists from all over the world for years, until events made that unfeasible in the last few years, with ISIS. Maybe that will change now that ISIS is on the run, but it will take some time to take stock on how much destruction was wrought. And what would normally be considered a bad thing, but in hindsight was a good thing, many of the artifacts discovered at Dura Europos throughout the years have been transported to museums in the US and Europe and other places. Many of the items we will discuss with the Dura Europos House Church are housed in the Yale University Art Museum collection. Now is a good time to get our geographic bearings first, so that you don't have to pull your car over or take a break from whatever you're doing to pull up a map. I'll give you the quick mental map that you can keep in your mind. Picture the country of Syria, which is more or less the shape of a right triangle. The left side of the triangle running straight north to south is the Mediterranean Sea and the borders with Israel and Lebanon. The top part of the triangle, running more or less straight east to west, is the country's border with Turkey. The hypotenuse, running from northeast to southwest, is the border with mostly Iraq but also parts of Jordan. Right in the middle of the hypotenuse, the Euphrates River crosses into Syria. Approximately 30 miles or 50 kilometers or so from the border with Iraq, sits the site of the city of Dura Europos on a high bank overlooking the Euphrates. Now, the city was never called Dura Europos in its day. The city was variously known as Dura or Europos, depending on who was running the show at the time. I think an analogy might be sometime, say 2,000-ish years from now, archaeologists might, discover this ruined city of New York City, and they might call it New York Amsterdam because the records they find would show the settlement in that area carried both names at different times. Now, the original settlement goes back sometime in the ancient past. The name Dura comes from a Semitic word for fortress, and that's really what the site always was, a fortress of one sort or another. After Alexander the Great and his Hellenistic successor kingdoms came to the party, particularly the Seleucids, the town got the name Europos, which was the name of another town somewhere in northern Greece, Balkans type area. When you get a chance to look at that map, though, you will see that Dura Europos is in the middle of nowhere. It's in a very inhospitable section of the Middle East, even today. Back in the early part of the Common Era, Dura Europos was still in the middle of nowhere, but it was in a very strategically important middle of nowhere. The site of the town was on the highly fluid border between the Western Greco-Roman empires of the west and the Persian-based empires to the east. Dura was on the Euphrates River on the major trading routes on the way from the east, like Silk Road type things, to the very important trading city of Palmyra. Controlling the area around Dura was incredibly important to controlling east-west trade. The city went back and forth a number of times between the various eastern and western powers, and each put their own stamp on the city. We can see how and why the location of the city was important on the macro scale. We can zoom in now and see why this particular point Dura Europos resided on was beneficial. Dura Europos sits on a 90-meter, 300-odd-foot cliff overlooking the Euphrates River. On two sides of the city are deep wadis, or ravines you could also say. The two wadis, or ravines, and the steep drop-off of the Euphrates River made it impossible for an ancient army to attack Dura on those three sides, the north, south, and east sides. In order to protect that last approach, western approach, an approximately 900-meter, half-mile-long wall was constructed with regularly spaced towers and a gate that connected the two wadis that flanked either side of the city. This all makes for a really imposing-looking city. The civic buildings built near the cliff, which drops off to the Euphrates, really must have had some of the most amazing views I can imagine, and that's just based on photographs. It must be breathtaking in real life. I mentioned earlier that the city was held by the Persians, Greeks, Romans, and more, and because of that, the city had a very diverse population. It had Persians, Greeks, Romans, Palmyrans, Hebrews, local peoples, you name it. They all lived, spoke their languages, worshipped their gods, and left their marks on Dura Europos. This is a long way around to say that Dura Europos was important in a real ancient world melting pot. Understanding these points will help us get a better lay of the land, so to speak, on why there was a very early Christian community in this far-off place and how this particular Christian community fits into the larger situation. Dura Europos is a city frozen in time. In fact, in a very specific point of time, 256 AD to be exact. Knowing this date is incredibly important to put every archaeological find into context. Dura Europos is often called the Pompeii of the desert because, much like Pompeii, Dura Europos did not fade out as an important city after years of decline. An example you might use of the opposite is a city like Ostia outside of Rome. It shrunk over the course of years and decades. Buildings fell into ruin while the city was still occupied, and then some buildings were repurposed. Finally, people just abandoned the site altogether and moved a couple of miles away. That is not what happened in either Pompeii or Dura. Dura Europos was involved in a documented siege in 256 by the Persian Sasanian Empire. Once the Sasanians successfully took the city, most of the population that was left was sold into slavery, as was the custom of the day, and the city was never repopulated. It just ended right there. For a smallish town, Dura Europos was chock full of religious buildings. Archaeologists have been able to identify at least 17 buildings that had a religious purpose, including the house church, an early synagogue, a Mithraeum, and the famous Temple of the Palmyrene Gods. The house church, synagogue, and the Mithraeum were all located on the same street within a few blocks of each other. All of these buildings were right near the main wall of Dura, which was not very good for the people who used those buildings in 256 or owned or worshipped in them, but actually was a really great thing for us to understand Dura for us today. The synagogue and the church were separated by only 2 blocks. When we get to speculating on who made up the Dura Europos house church congregation, that fact will lend us some fodder for our speculation. It was also great that these buildings were located by the wall because that's what preserved them so well. When the Sasanians put the town to siege, the Romans built up a defensive fortification called a glacis, or glossus. I don't know, my upstate New York speak might be getting in the way of that one, but they built this glacis against the wall. A glacis, for all of you who are not in the siege works business, is a slope built up against a wall to further fortify it. This glacis helps strengthen the wall against rocks, battering rams, etc. The person running the defense of Dura must have thought that they were in pretty desperate straits if he thought that destroying an entire street of buildings was necessary to defend the city. It turns out the commander was right, though. The glacis wall helped for some times, but the Sasanians were serious about taking this town, and they wound up digging underneath the city and went in that way. More importantly than how the siege ended, to build the glacis, the Romans filled in the existing buildings along the wall with dirt, rubble, and dust. That preserved the contents of the building incredibly well. The buildings were not perfectly preserved, as the top floors were actually cut off at an angle to form the glacis. The preservation isn't perfect in that sense, but it still is pretty good preservation. I'm sure you know that I love a good piece of historical fiction. It puts the flesh on the bones of what the archaeology and primary sources give us, and it tells us a nice story. I really suggest you read the book Fire in the East by Harry Sidebottom. I stumbled on that book a few years ago, having never heard of Dura Europos. He gives the city a fictionalized name to give himself a little more license for the drama that happened in the book. Other than that, Sidebottom really follows the story of the siege of Dura Europos in 256 very accurately. I believe the author is a classicist or something like that during the day and a fiction author at night, so he brings a really unique perspective to the book. Fire in the East is the first of a series surrounding this one character, which I really enjoyed the whole series. When the book first came out, it was difficult to get your hands on, but now it's on Kindle, Audible, and I'm sure all the other platforms people use to get books, maybe even a physical copy. I just think that this may be a book of the month for the book drawing for Patreon supporters. If you're a $5 Constantinople patron or a Rome level patron, you are entered into the monthly book drawing. So go over to patreon.com/papacy to become a patron. You're not only supporting the show, you get personalized shoutouts and the chance to win great books. I should also mention the primary book I used researching this episode, and that's called The World's Oldest Church by Michael Pepper from Fordham the book, he's from Fordham University, but the book's published by Yale University Press. This is just a very detailed book by this professor who had direct access to the artifacts and the scholars who studied these artifacts. The book is actually an enjoyable read for, like an academic scholarly work. It's also available in paper and electronic versions. I found it on Amazon Kindle. I also used a number of lectures given by scholars involved in the excavations of Dura and curating the artifacts. These are all easily available on YouTube, searching the keywords Dura Europos. The church at Dura Europos is called a house church, and that's exactly what it was. The church was a house that was repurposed and renovated as a church. This building was not purposefully built to be a church originally. It followed the classic floor plan of a Roman house, and really a not bad Roman house at that. The ground floor was approximately 2,500 square feet, or roughly 230-ish square meters. We know there was an upper level because there's a set of stairs leading up, but that section of the house was almost completely destroyed by the construction of the glacis. There is also a stairway leading to a basement. We can take a quick tour through the house church to get ourselves acclimated to where we're going to be hanging out for a little while. Take off your shoes before you go in. Did the Romans take off their shoes before going into a house? No. More than likely, I guess people would wear some sort of sandal, I would imagine. Whether you're the take your shoes off type of person or not, when you go into a house, you would walk into this house from the northeast corner into a vestibule. That was definitely a common Roman house feature. The next common feature is you would walk from the vestibule into a large central courtyard. This courtyard gave you access to all of the rest of the first floor of the house. To your right would be a portico area separated off by columns. That was often a lounging area, but you could easily see it being an area used to congregate before, after, or in between church activities. If you walked straight across the courtyard, you would enter the meeting area or the assembly hall. The assembly hall stretched the entire south side of the building, except for a small room at the east end, which was separated from the main hall by a recessed arch area. The main room is estimated to have been able to hold in the neighborhood of 75 people at max capacity. That's a surprisingly large amount of people. At this earliest time, local congregations Christians were thought to be much, much smaller than that, especially considering that Christianity was not quite a legal religion at this point. It was still, in fact, an illicit religion. How much that meant way off on the frontier is anybody's guess at this point. Nobody knows exactly how this assembly area was used. Originally, the assembly room was divided into 2 different rooms, but when the house was renovated into a church, that dividing wall was removed. That shows the people who wanted to repurpose this space for use as a church wanted a large interior space for gathering. Besides the central courtyard, there is no other space large enough for a decent amount of people to gather. Presumably, this is where the liturgy, gospel reading, sacraments, or other official church business was carried out. The recessed arch on the eastern end is interesting because something like that was found in the Dura Europa synagogue and the Mithraeum as well. That space could have held sacred objects or books. It is really interesting because in another excavation in Dura near the Palmyrene Gate, a fragment of either the Dia Tesseron or a similar harmonized version of the 4 Gospels was found. If you remember way back a few episodes ago, I noticed that harmonized versions of the Gospel were particularly popular in Syrian Christianity. This is our first good spot to do some speculation. It is possible the small room attached to the main assembly hall was some early version of the sanctuary. This could have been the space where the leader, maybe even a bishop, performed the acts required for the Lord's Supper or Eucharist. It's also possible that these functions were done on some form of altar out in the main area, and the smaller room was more like a vestry or a storage area for sacred objects. There's many other options as well. From the assembly room, you could walk back into the courtyard or go into the next room that took up the central part of the western section of the building. This room is called the Sunday School Room or the Teaching Space. This room had access to the courtyard, assembly room, and the baptistry next door, which we'll get into next. There isn't a ton of evidence to say that this actually was a teaching space. Here is another area where we can have some fun speculation. I don't know if I agree that this was a teaching area. If you look at the next post-Constantine version of a church building, the Basilica, there's no teaching space contained in the building. Catechumens would have stood outside of the church in the narthex and progressively worked their way in. In some traditions, before the recitation of the Nicene Creed, which technically wouldn't have existed at that point, but some version of a creed statement existed even as early as 256, the words, the doors, is said. This tradition of closing the doors of the church, separating the initiated members of the church from those not yet initiated, was a very old custom. That was a call to actually close the doors to the sacred space so that the uninitiated couldn't observe the mysteries inside. And that's actually something you see in a lot of the mystery religions going on at that time. It was not the norm for catechumens to be so close to the action in later years. In much of Christian history, the purpose of the first part of the Mass or the liturgy was actually for teaching. This is the part both initiated, baptized members and the catechumens would hear. Formal study outside of the liturgical context was not the norm for either initiated members or uninitiated. Something like, say, a Bible study is a long, long way off in the future. Although this could have been the teaching space in the sense that because it was next to the assembly hall and the baptistry, the catechumens could hear what was going on in the assembly hall, but couldn't see the mysteries and weren't allowed to be in there yet because they weren't fully admitted members yet. Maybe that space could be closed off. I don't know. That seems like it would be a little awkward. The next room going clockwise was the baptistry. This is where the catechumens were made into full members of the church through baptism or full immersion in water. The space takes up about a quarter of that side of the building, maybe a third. Very interesting iconography was found in that area of the church, which we will get into more in the next episode. The baptistry was also added in the renovation of the house, which actually occurred not too long before the destruction of the town. The actual pool that was used for baptism is about the size of a modern-day bathtub, but a little bit deeper. In between the baptistry and the vestibule was a set of stairs leading to that upper level we mentioned earlier. My best guess for what was upstairs is that it became a living quarters for the people who maybe originally owned the house, and then, they made their entire first floor into a house church, or that upper level could have served as the rectory, like maybe the owners of this house donated the entire building for a church purpose and had a leader. I don't know. That's questionable, but there's a lot of fun speculation for that as well, especially how bishops and church hierarchy were organized at that time and in that specific place. There is so much more to discuss, though, in this house church. Now we have a nice lay of the land, we can discuss the art in more detail and get into the functions of the room in more depth. I think this flyover was a good way to start because I felt we needed to get a sense of the history and the context of this city of Dura Europos and why the town even existed. Then we needed just a little overview of the church itself before we can really dive into that iconography and art. We'll also be spending a little time in the Dura Europos synagogue as well, because that's a really exciting space as well. Unfortunately, we won't be able to give the synagogue as much time as it really deserves because it has its own history and context with an early post-Second Temple rabbinical Judaism. One thing I will say now, and we'll eventually talk about in the next episode, is how full of pictures the synagogue was as well. It was chocked full of incredibly well-done pictures and iconography from the Old Testament, which is definitely of note because most synagogues of today, and really many of the times after this, have very little in the way of sacred art, especially not large-scale representations of biblical stories. It's also worth pointing out how much better executed the art of the synagogue was as compared to the house church. I really look forward to getting into all of this and much, much more. I hope you'll join me. A huge shout out goes to our Rome level patrons, Peter the Great, Mary Carmen, who's awesome, and Seth the Magnificent. I want to thank our wonderful Constantinople level patrons on patreon.com/papacy, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, Yoren, and Molly, as well as our Alexandria level patrons, Francine and Richard. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward, as always, to seeing you on our next step on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.